All right, welcome to our lunch study session today. As you know, my name is Rabbi Ain, and we've been so far here in 2021. We've really been trying to uncover the foundations of conservative movement, the foundations of our synagogue. Our synagogue is celebrating its centennial this year. The date that it was established was 1921. We are in 2021, and we're going back to the roots and to the foundations of our movement, of our organization, to see what we have stood for in the past, how the movements, the denominations, and American Jewish life have evolved over the past 150 years. And then ultimately, if you're wondering where I'm taking all of this, obviously I'm going to take this directly into our community's vision statement, which is who are we as a synagogue and how are we going to express our values based upon what we have learned in our study and where we would like to see this community go for the next 100 years. So basically, you've been participating in a think tank. So I want to thank you for doing that. And just a brief catch up for those who are new to us as I try to get comfortable here. Ignore my sweatpants. We've been discussing we are talking ultimately about how the movement developed. And now the movement really came about, and I'm just going to share my screen here very quickly. So let me share my screen. The movement came about really as a synthesis of these two main points that existed in if I want to invite people not, yes, you can invite everybody. These conversations are open to public and you are absolutely welcome to invite people to join us. So feel free to, and of course, this is going to be recorded. So if people can't attend, you can also invite them to subscribe to our YouTube page. But what we have here in the 19th century is a split. And this split is really best articulated. I'm going to move through this quickly so I can get to our main topic today. But that split is ultimately best expressed by the positions of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was coming from the Orthodox position or the modern Orthodox position, and the Pittsburgh Platform, which in November of 1885 articulated the Reform position. I'm just going to go through this very quickly so we have a bearing of the teacher we're going to learn about today. So just the Pittsburgh Platform, two key statements in that. Number 4, I've highlighted it here. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws, such as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress, originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They failed to impress the modern Jew with the spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. Number 6, in the Pittsburgh Platform, we recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. We are convinced of the utmost necessity of preserving the historical identity with our great past. Christianity and Islam being daughter religions of Judaism, we appreciate their providential mission to aid in the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. We acknowledge that the spirit of broad humanity of our age is our ally in the fulfillment of our mission, and we therefore extend the hand of fellowship to all who cooperate with us in the establishment of the reign of truth and righteousness amongst men. This was most clearly and effectively countered by the great Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who questioned rather acutely those two points that I just laid out for you. So he asks this: religion allied to progress. Do you, dear reader, know what that means? What does that mean? Hirsch asks. Religion allied to progress. He thinks it means virtue allied to sensual enjoyment, rectitude allied to advancement, uprightness allied to success. It means a religion and a morality which can be preached also in the haunts of vice and iniquity. It means sacrifice in religion and morality to every man's momentary whim. It allows every man to fix his own goal and progress in any direction he pleases, and to accept from religion only that part which does not hinder his progress or even assist it. And his motto is instead Yafet Talmud Torah Im Derech Eretz, which is a beautiful thing to study Torah combined with the ways of the world. And so if you ask what's the difference ultimately between the Pittsburgh platform and Rabbi Hirsch, he says it's a mere trifle. They aim at religion allied to progress, and we have seen that this principle negates the truth of what they call religion, while we aim at progress allied to religion. To them, progress is the absolute, and religion is governed by it, and to us, religion is the absolute. For them, religion is valid only to the extent that it does not interfere with progress. For us, progress is valid only to the extent that it does not interfere with religion. And he says rather cheekily, that is all the difference, but this difference is abysmal. Okay, so there you go. That's the 19th century conflict. Out of that conflict comes Solomon Schechter. We've discussed Solomon Schechter. We've talked about his positive historical history, the establishment of the seminary. And ultimately, it was a wonderful synthesis that did very well for the 20th century, because here in, what year was this, Harvey? 1945, excuse me. Here we are, 1945, the cover of Time magazine, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, what is believed to be the peak of the Jewish movement historically, Rabbi Finkelstein appearing on the cover of Time magazine with the caption, "The days of fear are over." And so we're going to talk about who Louis Finkelstein was. He was the chancellor of our movement, and we're going to take a look at a piece that comes, I hope you can see this, The Things That Unite Us. Does everyone see this? The Things That Unite Us. It's a speech that he gave in 1927. And I like this approach because, you know me, I'm a big tent kind of rabbi, and I like to have all sides sort of under the same rubric. And so Rabbi Finkelstein here is going to address some of the issues that we've been talking about through the work of Schechter and through the work of Harold Kushner, which is, let's stop focusing perhaps on those areas of division. What makes reform? I mean, I hear this constantly as a rabbi in San Francisco. I'm sure every rabbi here says, well, are you this or are you that? Or do you believe this or do you believe that? The first question that anybody gets when they meet me, what kind of rabbi are you, right? And then, well, do I have to do this? So, I mean, it comes up. So Dr. Finkelstein is going to focus instead on the things that unite us and seek to craft a movement and a big tent based around those issues. So before we begin, I just want to welcome Rabbi Finkelstein's grandson, Harvey. So let's say hello. Harvey, you're unmuted. You got to unmute yourself here.
My pop is here. I got to teach him.
Oh, I still can't hear you, even if you are.
I hear him.
With your microphone there. And I know that, Harvey, you wanted to invite your father.
He's here.
And he's here.
Yes, he's on.
So he's Rab Mike.
Yeah.
He's Rab Mike. Is that him?
Yeah.
That is him. But his name is Ezra.
Right.
Okay, so Rab Mike is Louis Finkelstein's son.
I got to get him.
Rabbi Ezra Finkelstein. We are blessed. And Rabbi Finkelstein must be, how old's your dad? He must be
94 in a month.
94 years old, I think you said. I'm not bad at reading lips. No, I'm okay. So we're gonna figure that out. But we are blessed to have both Rabbi Finkelstein's son and his grandson who are going to join us for this conversation. That is one of the treats. So if this is your first time you're joining us on our Wednesday session, I love bringing in guests who are able to add a little color to the history of our movement. And so we are blessed and we'll be hopefully hearing from them. So Rabbi Finkelstein, if you can speak, go right ahead and say hello. But as you get that figured out, I want to go to this obituary. So let me just open up this obituary, and here we go. The Jewish Telegraph Agency, Monday, December 2nd, 1991. Monday, December 2nd, 1991. We'll get to further iterations of the Pittsburgh platform. I see there are some questions. Yes, the Pittsburgh platform has been updated in a number of times, but we'll get there. We're not up to the 30s just yet. But here in December 2nd, 1991, if I scroll down here, we have the obituary for Louis Finkelstein, was Chancellor Emeritus of JTS. Let's see if I can't make this bigger. I'll read it to you. Funeral services were held Sunday at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America for Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, its Chancellor Emeritus, who died Friday after a long bout with Parkinson's disease. He was 96 years old. Finkelstein, who transformed the seminary from a rabbinical school to a prestigious institute of higher Jewish learning, had an impact that also reached to secular society. Among those he brought to the Institute of Conservative Judaism was Chief Justice Earl Warren, who spent a Shabbat studying Torah at the seminary. And if John Roberts is watching, you are welcome to spend a Shabbat with us here in San Francisco. So extensive was Finkelstein's influence that in October 1951, the rabbi was the subject, as we just saw, of Time magazine cover story. On January 20th, 57, he was invited to give a blessing at the second inauguration of President Eisenhower. Finkelstein, who was also the seminary's Solomon Schechter Professor of Theology, had a long and distinguished career. He created the Cantor's Institute, the College for Jewish Music, the West Coast branch that ultimately became the University of Judaism. He also founded the seminary's Institute for Religious and Social Studies, and in 1986, that was renamed for him. In 1939, he created the Conference of Science, Philosophy, and Religion. He was the son of a rabbi, and he was born in Cincinnati, and he moved to Brooklyn when he was 7. He was a graduate of City College, doctorate at Columbia, and he was the rabbi at KI in the Bronx until 31. And in 37, he was named the seminary's provost and became its president in 1940 and the chancellor in 51. He was a pioneer in interfaith outreach. He made the ecumenical world aware of the centrality of the Judeo-Christian heritage, said Ismar Shorsh, authored numerous books, 4-volume work on the Leviticus, on the Sifra. He wrote several books on the Pharisees, and Shorsh says that he rehabilitated the Pharisees for Christian America. Among his other works were a biography of Rabbi Akiva and Sadia Gaon, and that is it. That is the obituary for Rabbi Finkelstein. So let's now go to his piece on what unites us, the things that unite us. And he's speaking here to the Rabbinical Assembly back in 1927. And again, this is on the heels of this. This is the problem. We're focused in on progress. We're going to focus on progress, or we're going to focus in on tradition. One group prioritizes progress over tradition. The other group prioritizes tradition over progress. Here comes Dr. Finkelstein. We are all members of the Rabbinical Assembly, vaguely aware of our fundamental unity of aim and point of view. We have our differences, but even without analyzing them, we know that they are slight in comparison with our basic agreement in essentials. Taking this for granted, we prefer to discuss when we meet those aspects of our work and faith which divide us. This is stimulating. I'm guilty of this. For those who've been joining me for our lunch session since this pandemic started, you certainly know I like to focus on those areas that create some nice Talmudic discourse, and perhaps those can be taken as divisive. Taking this agreement for granted, we prefer to discuss when we meet that which divides us. This is stimulating to the mind, and it emphasizes our individuality, but may tend to obscure in our own minds our basic unity. We are apt to develop the psychology of brothers in a large family who to all outsiders look and act alike, and yet are continually bickering with one another about the minute differences of taste and manner. So this is almost 100 years later, right? This is 27, this is 100 years later. This is all changed, right? We don't act like this way at all now. We no longer bicker over small tastes and differences. Of course not. So we've evolved a lot in 100 years. Who know better than we rabbis how frequently families are disrupted because a husband and wife suddenly discovers an affinity with some stranger with whom only a few casual commonplaces have been exchanged. It is only later, when the harm has been done and cannot be remedied, that the realization comes that then it was better with me than now. So as I've been listening to the papers read at our convention and following the activities of our members, I have been profoundly impressed with the need of analyzing and reducing to a rational basis our indefinite consciousness of unity. Okay, so pause. For those of you who were with us last week, what do you think is the difference in purpose between what Dr. Finkelstein is going to attempt to do here? Oh, I hear, wait, hold on. Well, and I was going to say, and emet ve'emunah. So just so you know, Rabbi Finkelstein, hello. And Harvey, last week we discussed emet ve'emunah, and there was a lot of criticism. Rabbi Finkelstein, there's a lot of criticism of emet ve'emunah. And I was just curious, what I'm going to, after I say hi to Rabbi Finkelstein, while you think about what's the difference in agenda that Dr. Finkelstein is taking up here, as opposed to the agenda by the committee that took up emet ve'emunah. So first I want to say hi to Rabbi Finkelstein. Hello, how are you? Can you unmute yourself?
I'm going to call him.
All right, he's still muted. We'll get him. We'll get him to work. Look at all those books. Are those your pop's books? Are those your dad's books?
Louis' books were sold to the seminary when he passed.
All right, we'll get, oh, there we go. Hey, we
Yes.
still can't hear you. By the way, we cannot hear the Finkelsteins even when they're still muted.
I hear him.
And I
guys hear
hear
them?
too.
I hear.
I hear him.
You hear them? You can hear them. You can hear them, but I can't hear
Yes.
them.
Yes, we hear him.
Ah, so you could always hear Harvey. Okay, that is
He's got a loud voice.
So I can't hear anything that you're saying, but you can still hear me. Oh, do you know why that is? Because I have on mute. So here, Rabbi,
Yes.
I'm saying Rabbi Finkelstein, Ezra Finkelstein is with us. And he, of course, is more technologically advanced than I am. So here I am in San Francisco, Rabbi, and I've muted myself.
Been there, done that.
Right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit. Can you share a little bit about your father with us? We're studying the piece, the things that unite us.
Yes, I've been following it.
Oh, good. So share a little bit about who he was as he stepped into this controversy.
My father was born in 1895. That his father was a rabbi and descendant from generations of rabbi. We're not sure how far back it goes. I've been able to trace my ancestry to my great-grandfather, who was buried in Queens, New York. My grandfather came here in 1886, and his wife had already given birth to 3 children. My father was born about 10 years after my grandfather got here. My grandfather at the time was a rabbi in Cincinnati. He had been ordained in Lithuania and had studied with great rabbis. One of his ordinations came from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, for whom Yeshiva University in New York is named.
Yes.
That his first position was in Baltimore, Maryland, and then he moved to Cincinnati, where my father was born in June 1895. Subsequently, my grandfather moved the family to Syracuse, and then finally, in 1902, the family moved to Brooklyn, New York, where my grandfather was a rabbi of a congregation in Brownsville, which is what was at the time one of the centers of Jewish life in New York. My grandfather had children subsequent. My father was the last of the boys that were born to my grandparents. There were 8 children, and my father was the fifth of the fifth son. There were 3 daughters. That my father was educated in the public schools of Brooklyn, New York. He attended high school in Brooklyn, went to City College, and at the same time that he went to City College, he began studies as an undergraduate at the Jewish Theological Seminary. The 4 years he was at CCNY, he studied at the pre-rabbinical program of the seminary, and he made the acquaintance of Solomon Schechter, that he had a really close relationship with Dr. Schechter, and Dr. Schechter had a profound influence on him. He also was a student of a teacher at the seminary named Israel Friedlander. Israel Friedlander was teaching Bible at the seminary. My father was an apt Bible student and had a close relationship with Dr. Friedlander. In fact, that it was through Dr. Friedlander that my father met the sister-in-law of Dr. Friedlander, whose name was Carmel Bentwich. They were married after my father graduated the seminary, and that my mother came from an English background, that they were married. They raised 3 children. My older sister, Hadassah Davis, who passed away a couple of years ago, myself, and my younger sister, Amuna, who lives in Jerusalem. My grandmother, who died before I was born, had a vision of my father being the one in the family to maintain the family tradition of sons who entered the rabbinate. And my father did that, became a rabbi at a congregation in the Bronx called Kehelet Israel, which was one of the large congregations in East Bronx at the time. And he served that congregation from 1919 to 1931 for 12 years. What took him out of the congregation was the worldwide depression in 1928. That the congregation could barely afford to pay him, the seminary offered him a position as the teacher of a chair in theology dedicated to Solomon Schechter. That he was the Solomon Schechter chair professor at the seminary from 1931 until he died. His close relationship with Schechter was followed by a close relationship with Dr. Louis Ginsberg, who was the teacher of Talmud at the seminary, and Professor Alexander Marks, who was its librarian.
Yeah, Rabbi, let me stop you. As you talk about the relationships that he has between the other, we've been discussing, and in fact, so just a little bit. So a little bit of a tease.
He succeeded Cyrus Adler as president in 1940.
Well, here's a little tease I have for you here. We're not going to get to this today, but here's a little tease, which is 1945 piece by a colleague of his, Rabbi Kaplan. And I have a lot of aficionados of Dr. Kaplan, as you might imagine, in my community. Can you tell me what the relationship was like between Dr. Finkelstein and Dr. Kaplan?
It was a tortured relationship. It was a very close personal relationship, but a very difficult theological relationship. Dr. Kaplan officiated at my sister's wedding, which was a way of that my father showing his deep affection for Dr. Kaplan, but that they differed radically on the issue in which my father was supposed to be an expert, namely theology. Dr. Kaplan was invested with a great love of modernity and of change. My father was invested with a great devotion to tradition, and that it was only on those issues that they did not come together. Now, my Kaplan
only on those, just those.
Yes, that when I was a student at the seminary, I had with other students a luncheon with Dr. Kaplan, and that Dr. Kaplan was scrupulous in his observance of the commandments, as my father was. But on the other hand, that my father was a traditionalist when it came to theology, that he was comfortable with rabbinic theology as it's understood in the Talmud, of a transcendent God who commands and a people with whom he has a covenant.
That's the hang up. That's the hang up. There it is, right there.
that for Dr. Kaplan, that the anthropomorphic God didn't exist. He had a vision of God being as a force in the universe, but not as a deity with a personality. And that
But why does that matter so much? Why does that disagreement matter so much? Why was it such a torturous relationship over that disagreement?
Because my father was invested by the traditions of his father, namely that you follow the commandments faithfully, and that you're very careful about not changing any of the rabbinic tradition that developed in the rabbinic era. That he was that if the Midrash and the Talmud said it was so, it was so.
What happens if I want to drive to shul? What happens if I want to drive to shul, though?
I'm sorry?
What happens if I want to drive to shul?
That my father would never drive to shul on a Shabbos. That when he couldn't walk to the seminary in his 80s, that he found a synagogue on 110th Street that he could go to. That and when he could no longer walk because he was a victim of Parkinson's disease, that the students and members of the faculty came to his apartment where I'm living right now. That they came to his apartment.
You're on 103rd? Are you on 103rd?
Sefer Torah, and those disciples who were close to him came and enabled him to fulfill the mitzvah of davening with the community.
That's right. That's right, Akiva. We also have Joe Roth's son is also with us here, KOE. So, Rabbi, I see. I guess I'm in San Francisco. I forgot what happens when you invite a rabbi on. I forgot. So I've been away from New York long enough. I forgot. So
I'm taking up as much time as
no. Go right ahead. In fact, I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anybody want to ask Rabbi Finkelstein any questions? I've been hugging up all of the questions. I know that we've been studying these texts. I'm sure, Gary, you can think of plenty of questions you'd like to know about the seminary's history here. Does anybody have questions? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
I'll start with one. One of the things I was curious about is at the time when he wrote this, the RA right now is fairly homogeneous. And the Rabbinical Assembly at the time he wrote this incorporated rabbis who had Reform congregations, Orthodox congregations, Sephardic congregations. And you said he was pretty frum. So how did he deal with that diversity amongst the Rabbinical Assembly?
It was a source of great problems for him. That in 1945, a close disciple of his named Milton Steinberg, who was the rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, that told his congregation that the appeal that he'd made on Yom Kippur, which was usually for the Jewish Theological Seminary, which raised a large amount of money, would not be held that year because he disagreed that radically. Milton Steinberg was a disciple of Dr. Kaplan's, and also a staunch friend of my father's, but that he didn't feel that my father's leadership of the seminary was leading it in the right direction. My father became involved with programs run by the seminary, the interfaith programs, intercultural programs, the Conference of Science, Philosophy, and Religion, and that Dr. Steinberg felt that more emphasis had to be made, that as now current, to teaching rabbis to be able to be ministers to Jewish congregations, that understanding that there would be a diversity of practice and of viewpoint from rabbi to rabbi and congregation to congregation, and that was more important than the seminary becoming, as it was in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the major center of Jewish learning, not only in the United States, but in much of the rest of the world.
Do you think he won? Do you think Steinberg won out? I mean, view it 80 years later. I mean, Steinberg seems to be the victor, no?
that in turn, yes, that ultimately, yes, that my father was able to create for a brief period of time disciples who were close to him and would follow that much of his thought and his viewpoint. Rabbis like Rabbi Waxman of Great Neck.
You've studied him as well, yeah.
Yes, the Rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue.
The current?
Milton Steinberg, as I said, that many leaders and that of the Jewish communities all over the country were.
What would he say now? What would your father say
Seminary.
now? What would your father say now about the? This is a loaded question about the state of the conservative movement in the seminary.
That I don't know exactly what the state of the conservative movement is.
That is what he would say. That's right.
I will tell you that obviously, as in all movements, there's been a decline in the last decade, or last 2 decades, of religiosity in the American community. There has also been a tragic the development of increased intermarriage, which has diminished the sense of relevance of religion in American Jewish life. And the pandemic obviously has damaged synagogues across the country. As it has affected.
You're talking to San Francisco here, Rabbi. You're talking to San Francisco. Remember, you're talking to San Francisco here.
Been there, done that. That my wife always wanted to move to San Francisco. I just couldn't find the pulpit on the West Coast.
Okay. That's because Saul White was here all those years. Saul White had this place locked down. Other questions? Do we have other questions for Rabbi Finkelstein? I'm waiting for Ben Chin to ask a Kaplan question. I hope Ben Chin has a Mordechai Kaplan question here. Ben Chin is our past president. He's here. He used to be a member of SAJ. So he came to us directly from SAJ. Here he is. Here he is.
I mean, I could sit and listen to stories about Mordechai Kaplan all day, but I don't think I have any questions.
I'm interested in hearing and seeing what the rest of this story is. That I'll be happy to come back online anytime in the future.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you. So let's get into your father's work a little bit and his essay, because what's so interesting from, I mean, just the beautiful historical color that you've given us is he really was adamant on theological in ways that Kaplan broke for him. So that makes this interesting when we focus in on this 1927 piece, when clearly Kaplan had already begun his Reconstructionist agenda by this point. And I read this as Dr. Finkelstein attempting to hold the fort, keep it all together. We want to hold this all together. That's how I read it. So he writes, only the more obvious truisms about our relations, excuse me 1 second. Hold on, I just have to, okay. Are pointed out, the more difficult task of studying them and clarifying must be left for further discussion. Hence, you must not expect to hear what you do not already know. Okay, yada, yada, yada. So let's go to God. Now, this is similar to what we discussed last week when we went through Emet ve'emunah. Here are the different classifications of what is in the rubrics of what it is we believe. And here, Dr. Finkelstein wants to have some sort of agreement. So he says, so far as I can see, we all agree that the visible world of which man is a part is but an island in a sea of truth which transcends it, and which is most clearly reflected in the human mind and conscience. The evils and cruelty, which from an integral part of the material world are for us not the final reality, behind them and giving them meaning is the ultimate good, whose validity is testified to by the human mind, though not dependent on it. Right, so that's open. That seems certainly poetic and open to interpretation. The spiritual truths which have always been associated with the name of God, are valid independently of man's knowledge or practice of them. The prophets and lawgivers of Israel were men who more clearly than any others felt the presence of God and came most directly in contact with his spiritual being. They knew less than we about the actions and movements of physical being, but incomparably more about the laws that govern spiritual life. They felt constantly in their daily lives the presence of God that we sense only in moments of ecstasy and under particularly favorable conditions. They knew what was right by intuition, by meta logic, if you will. Their works are therefore great in the sense in which no other literature, no matter how great or how beautiful, is inspired. To see the beauty of the world as Homer or Dante or Shakespeare saw it is an approach to an understanding of its deeper meaning, but is not the whole of it. The prophet was not merely a poet, he was a man of God, right? So he's saying more here, I think, than Kaplan would say. God thus revealed himself to Israel through Torah and the prophets. We can say he chose Israel in the sense that Israel was more keenly aware of his being than other people. This idea of chosenness was also something that Kaplan was very critical of. In Israel's recognition of God, we became aware of divine selection of Israel. It is therefore literally true that the inspiration of the Torah and the prophets is the expression of God's choice of Israel as his people. That's slightly circuitous of saying that we're the chosen people, but I think he's trying to leave in a little philosophical or theological wiggle room. For the God who revealed himself to us through the Torah and the prophets will have the same love that the prophets and the sages felt for him. Our heart yearns for him like that of the psalmist whose soul thirsted for God. We are not talking empty metaphors. You hear me say this all the time. When we say that we feel the presence of God in the synagogue, especially on the high holy days like Yom Kippur, when people are assembled there in greatest numbers. You know, Rabbi, when I first came to San Francisco, so many people shared with me the power of that Ne'ilah service as being the highlight. And I think that's what Rabbi Finkelstein is saying here, that at times when our minds are properly attuned, we feel the exaltation of his inspiration when we read the Bible or study the Talmud or recite the prayers. But on the other hand, with all the great Jewish thinkers of the past, from the writer of Chronicles to the Septuagint, to the Targum, Talmud, to Maimonides, to Halevi, we feel that if God is to be made intelligible to men of intelligence as well as to others, the conception of him must be stripped of anthropomorphisms which satisfy the needs of the uninitiate. We fear that the last 3 or 4 centuries have produced in Israel a deterioration of the conception of God, just as they resulted in the deadening of our feeling for the Torah. And we must teach our children and our following to feel the presence of God, and at times, at the same time, not to think of God merely in human terms. So both a God who is with us, who we can sense, as well as a transcendent God. We can as little reconcile ourselves to reducing Judaism to a cold and dispassionate doctrinism as we can hope to maintain in an age of widespread education a conception of God that marks a definite retrogression from that attained by Halevi or Joseph Albo. We are thus a unit even in our understanding of the ultimate basis of all religious life, and insist that only in our faith, which is frankly based on our emotions and intuition, but which we seek to formulate with proper recognition of the scientific facts that have been established, is there room for the conception of God that can remain living and effective in our children's minds. Why does he end with our children's minds there? He was doing great until he sort of qualified it with our children's minds. What do we think of that? What do we think of Dr. Finkelstein's approach to theology here? How does it strike us? And just because his son is here doesn't mean you guys can't be your normal sort of critical selves. Thoughts? Anybody? We like this? Do we agree? Can we get on board with it? Or is it too far? Does it ask too much of us theologically? Somebody. You guys have all gone quiet. You guys quiet. Come on, go right ahead. Anybody? All right, so maybe it does. Okay, so maybe it does. All right, I take from your silence that maybe it is asking a little bit too much of us theologically. But I do want to point out that what his agenda here, and I think it is perhaps the distinguishing line between him and Kaplan, is he wants this faith part, this God part to be real. It's not an abstraction. It's not the power that makes for salvation. It's not some philosophical principle that we can loop into a nice bow. It's the feeling that we have at Ne'ilah in the shul that I can't explain, but it's real. And so I think what Dr. Finkelstein is trying to hold on to, and I think as a movement, I would aspire to hold on to this idea that is a real feeling, and that this God is not merely some philosophical abstraction, but can be both a part of our lives and greater than it. Ellen.
I resonate with that. And I know when I see plants grow or babies born, or there is a magic to all of this that is God in the world to me.
And I think that's what Dr. Finkelstein wants to maintain here. And that, we heard from his son, that's the tradition that he was born into, that his mother said, you have to pass this tradition on. And there is a realness that, the example that I've used, that my community's heard me use a number of times, is that our services can feel like Civil War reenactments, Rabbi. Like we can be saying the right words and standing in the right formations, but there's no real risk involved because it's play acting. And that's that. And I think that's what Dr. Finkelstein is questioning here. And I don't know, maybe some of you disagree. I think that is a flaw of Dr. Kaplan. I think that's a flaw, part of Dr. Kaplan's theology, which he spent many words trying to synthesize. And we will get to that ultimately this week, not next week, the following. Gary.
I have two questions for Rabbi Finkelstein about two stories that I don't know if they're apocrypha or not, about his father, which confused me a bit. On the one hand, he's the head of JTS. And the one legendary story is, and I'm forgetting the rabbis, but a rabbi from Israel wanted to go study at JTS Talmud. And he was told by the chief rabbi in Israel that as long as Rabbi Finkelstein was there teaching Talmud, that was okay with him. There was no problem. Yet on the flip side of that, it was rumored that he would not, if he were to attend a conservative service, if he was invited to one and to attend a conservative service, he'd go to a shkama minyan beforehand because he wouldn't feel he was yotzei, the mitzvah of davening, by going to a conservative shul. So how does he balance those two? Are those true stories? And if they are, how does he balance the idea of being head of JTS, the preeminent conservative institution, when he seemed to have such an ambivalence for what conservative Judaism professed to be?
Was that a question for me?
It was.
My father maintained that all the years that he was a part of the seminary faculty, that the seminary synagogue was a conservative synagogue, that no one would accept that definition today, because in the years in which I was growing up, the seminary synagogue had a virtual mechitza, that there was no barrier between the women's section and the men's section, but the men and women did not sit together. That the men sat on one side, the women sat on the other. That in today's world, that would be considered a modern Orthodox congregation. The services were all in virtually all in Hebrew. There were some prayers in English. The rituals that had been followed in my grandfather's synagogue in Brownsville were virtually identical with the ones that were practiced by the seminary and taught to the students of the seminary as a model that they should follow. The vast majority of them didn't. The American Jewish community was growing up to accept mixed seating, which had been instituted by the Reform movement. The idea of families not being together was an anathema to the communities and became an anathema to the rabbis. But that the model on which the seminary synagogue services were based was an Orthodox model. That what made it conservative, that it incorporated English readings, that its sermons were in English, that it was considered what the conservative synagogue should look like. Unfortunately, that the laity in the world didn't allow that to continue as a model. That when I was growing up,
I think that the laity didn't quite feel the same. They didn't quite feel it the same.
The rabbis understood that if they wanted to speak to a larger group, that they had to be able to accommodate themselves to the growing practice of American Judaism, that men and women should not be separated in the synagogue.
And here in this piece, Rabbi, he addresses that. He says, as to the proposed innovations and new interpretations, there is none of us so bigoted as to refuse to cooperate with those who are attempting them, which I really like, by the way, provided always that the ultimate purpose of the change is to strengthen the attachment of Israel to the whole of the Torah, and that it does not defeat its own end by striking at the fundamentals of Judaism. Okay, so what is that? We could not countenance, for instance, the substitution of Sunday for Shabbat. Yes, no, we certainly couldn't. Although most of us have acquiesced in the alteration of our school curricula so as not to place primary emphasis on conversational Hebrew rather than on prayers and mechanical reading, and have in one form or another accepted the late Friday evening synagogue assembly, which frankly aims to meet the religious needs of those who do not attend on Saturday morning. To permit Sunday to supersede the Shabbat would be a clear break with all of the things of our past. Okay, so that's pretty, no one's thinking about that at the moment. So that's not that controversial. Yeah.
Yeah, God is in the details.
That's right. God is definitely in the details. Well, what did you think? So tell us, where did you practice? When did you stop practicing as a rabbi? And I'm curious to know, in terms of his vision here and innovation. I mean, that's one of the threads that I see throughout Schechter.
Rabbi Ain,
yes,
that you're talking to a rebellious son. That the one thing I did not want to do with my life growing up was to become a rabbi. My father worked hard and long to convince me. After I was married and had a son, Harvey was born before I entered the seminary. It was in my 30s that I graduated and became a rabbi. That my journey in life is not what this is about. It's about conservative Judaism journey in life. I became a rabbi because I became convinced that I loved living and working with Jews. I didn't want to work in the American world. I wanted to work in the Jewish world.
Amen.
When I was a rabbi in several congregations which increasingly gave recognition to women in the congregation. But in my 30s, actually in my 40s, I became rabbi of a congregation in Syosset, New York, called Midway Jewish Center. And that when I was interviewed, they asked me, what would I do about enhancing the role of women in the congregation? I said, you have to give me 5 years to adjust to it myself. I've never been in one, and that it will take time for me to work out how we were going to do it.
Right.
It took better than 2 years for me to be able to integrate women into the congregation. By that time, a woman had been president of the congregation, and a girl had been given the right to have a bat mitzvah on the Sabbath morning, that I worked on changing the pattern of the congregation, and that in the course of time, the congregation adjusted to the idea that women should not be discriminated against in the synagogue.
Yeah, I think there's something really healthy about slow processes. I know it's very frustrating, and I know it was sort of when I spent my years at the seminary, it was certainly a butt of a joke about how long the conservative movement does take to make change. But I do think that there's something about rapid change and quick turning on the dime that is very destabilizing. Ben, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so it seems again like nobody knows where to draw the line as to how fast. I mean, the only sort of guidance that seems to be here is this idea of, breaking with our entire past. But anything we do that we've never done before is breaking with our entire past. So that's not really helpful. Right? It seems like what's being said here is really the same thing that we come back to is, well, we kind of know when we get there, and we'll see when we get there, and we don't know how much time it'll take. And the answer seems to be 10 years later than it takes the reform movement. That seems to be the answer. And I think that's not entirely satisfying.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's like predicting stock markets. Just because that has been the trend in the past doesn't necessarily mean it will continue to be the trend. They'll be 10 years ahead. I often dangerously like to quote C.S. Lewis, Rabbi, who said that when you're headed down the wrong path, the person who turns back first is the most progressive. Which I think is a nice quote. But on this, I just want to close out Dr. Finkelstein's words on this issue of change. We are a unit in opposition to any attempt to put Judaism in a straitjacket. And I think that is just so important because so many people, I'm amazed. I know I'm in California and San Francisco. They walk into the shul. They don't know who I am. They project this idea that I'm going to put their lives into a straitjacket. It comes up. It's ingrained, I think. Many, through ignorance or lack of vision, do not hesitate to insist that a practice once established shall always be retained. One is reminded of the retort made to a group of such bigoted stereotypists by the famous saint and scholar Rabbi Israel Lapkin Salanter half a century ago. The synagogue at Kovno, which had been built a century earlier, had, like all Lithuanian synagogues, never had a stove. When someone proposed to install some heating apparatus, opposition was raised on the ground that it would be untraditional. It has never been done, this intransigent argued. Why depart from the way of our fathers? Rav Israel overwhelmed them in a moment. Do you mean to say, he asked those who preferred to shiver traditionally rather than to be comfortable in a new way? Do you think that because our ancestors have done a foolish thing for 100 years, we must continue their folly forever, and the stove was installed? I love that. I mean, that's it. And I think, and I love the Salanter use of the warmth. And one of the issues where I resonate with Dr. Finkelstein is of the desire to create unity and of the desire to maintain that warmth, which I think the Ner Tamid, the light of tradition, fuels. And I think in our society, especially in the Bay Area, we have a lot of problems that we like to solve with Excel spreadsheets and algorithms. But I don't think that all problems can be solved in that fashion. I think our tradition, and I think as Rabbi Finkelstein expressed it so beautifully, and I was a lawyer too, Rabbi, and I also didn't want to live in the world of the American law. And I wanted to live in a life amongst Jewish people. So that really resonates. Gary Sokol.
Well, two things. First of all, Rabbi Finkelstein, when you said Midway, I was surprised because I grew up in Hicksville. So I went to many bar mitzvahs at Midway, but it was before you got there because it said you got there in 76. But interestingly, Rabbi Ain, and what you were reading, when I first came to Beth Sholom, and it was the heyday of B'nai Jeshurun in New York, where they had the early Shabbat and the late one had like 1,000 people, and it was the big single scene in New York. And I asked Rabbi Lou, why can't we have a late Shabbat here? You should have heard the talking to I got.
What did he say? What did he say?
Oh, no way. No way was Sholom ever going to have a late Shabbat service. And he used to get a lot of people to come for Shabbat when it was early. I mean,
but then tell Rabbi Finkelstein what happened next.
What, he created the meditation center?
No, the late Shabbat service was started at Emmanuel, and they got the 1,000 people every Friday night.
But in the old days, Rabbi Lou got hundreds of young people to come to young adults Beth Sholom yaps to the Shabbat Friday night Shabbat service.
It was. We didn't hold it in a chapel. We held it in the main sanctuary. It was packed, but it was early. It was not at 8 o'clock.
Judah.
There was also once when I think Michael Lerner was having services at the JCC, which certain members of Beth Sholom went to, and they used to dance all through the JCC at Kabbalat Shabbat. And some of the members came back and at Beth Sholom stood up and started dancing, and the look on Rabbi Lou's face was just, and I guess maybe the look was enough that they didn't do it a second time.
Wow, I didn't realize he was so against. Is that true? He was very much against he was a real Litvach. He didn't like any Hasidism at the show.
I'm not sure that's true, but
I was there.
Well, I was there too. But
I can name names of the people.
Bert, wait, I want to hear Bert.
Well, we're talking about Rabbi Lou in the old days. You're back in my realm. I did. When you read Rabbi Finkelstein's part about Ne'ilah, I have to say, Rabbi Lou did not like our old building, but he said the only time he really liked it was Ne'ilah. And that was because it was all packed with people and there was a certain spirit. And I wonder, going on that and some of the other things that Rabbi Finkelstein had said, how much is he talking about really emotions overriding reason, so to speak? If you're in the right, it's like, again, a lot of it goes back to the times probably, but it's like if you're in a huge gathering and everybody is together and while you're there, you can really feel the presence of God or the presence of Buddha or whatever happens to be your motivating factor. But the real question to me is when you go back home, do you keep that feeling or is it just like, enhanced emotions at a time? But
yeah, what do you think about that, Rabbi Finkelstein? The idea that perhaps your father places a strong emphasis on emotions and on feelings as having religious valence to it, like the Hasids might.
My father was far from a Chassid.
That we know, yes.
But the feelings and the psyche of the human being certainly plays a major part in their willingness to obey the rituals that are part of religious life. You have to feel religious, all right? That practicing the rituals is I won't say meaningless, but that is not truly a religious function unless you have a sensitivity to what the rituals mean to you personally. That the words of prayer are not as important as the feeling that there is a purpose to it, that there is a divinity that hears, that not necessarily affects what you want, but that we're not simply machines that give voice to what we do. that we are created in the image of God. All right, that there is something in us that is infinite and universal. That we are mortal, we are finite, but that our existence is not simply a mechanical one. There is a purpose to it, and a function to it, and a meaning to it, and that those things endure after we are gone.
Amen. And with that, we're going to close, and we're going to thank Rabbi Finkelstein.
My thanks to you for allowing me the time.
Oh, it is
audience.
completely our pleasure. And thank you to Harvey. I'm going to stop the recording at this moment.